Hey everybody, welcome to Readers Who Write. Today we're going to be talking about science fiction books, my personal favorites, and some book recommendations if you haven't already read them. So stick with us. We'll be right back after the jump and talk about that in detail. Hey everybody, welcome back. You saw the last two episodes where we talked about some of the big books that have affected me that I read and I really enjoyed. And as you saw, there was a large list of science fiction books, especially in that first episode where we were talking the big ones that shaped me as a writer. So today I wanted to talk about science fiction, why it's important to me, and why I feel it's important to society, and talk about some of my big book recommendations for you guys, so that if you either A, haven't actually tried the genre at all, you have something to start with, or if you love science fiction, maybe I'll have some good recommendations for you that you haven't tried yet. I do have several in here that aren't the big names, mainstream ones, but I've thoroughly enjoyed and have shaped the way I think about science fiction and how I view the world. So, first off, let's talk about it. Science fiction is typically defined in a very broad sense. It's typically defined as speculative fiction that focuses on the future, whether that be technology, government, human exploration, changes to human beings, extraterrestrial life. It's wide, and it's a vast genre that doesn't typically get the representation that I personally think it should, considering that it covers everything from near future tech developments to space exploration to aliens to a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. It's a massive scale of stories, and it has so much potential to both guide us as a society and point out things that we don't typically think about. So I want to focus on that a little bit today and talk about some of the themes that the stories tell and how they've shaped us. And this is true as much with science fiction, TV, and film as it is with books. Books started it all, but some of the big technological changes came from Star Trek, which does have a lot of books. I do recommend them. I'm not going to talk about any of them today, but there are vast amounts of them. I'll maybe throw up a couple covers here that are ones that I've loved. Star Trek is single-handedly the inspiration for cell phones. Well, maybe not single-handedly, but it is a major influence, and the creators of cell phones have actually cited Star Trek and the communicators used in the original series as inspiration for the phones. And we see that through all of the designs. As Star Trek has evolved and the flip phone became a thing, they pushed the boundaries to touchscreens, which led to smartphones and tablets, and so on. Recently, we've seen holographic imaging and very interesting twists on displays and interactive systems. And I can't wait to see how that's going to influence as well. For me personally, I didn't grow up in a household that was huge in science fiction. That's fine. My mother loves fantasy. She does enjoy portal fantasy, which kind of flirts with science fiction. And my dad is big into biographies, business books, although he does love a lot of the classics as well. It's a big reading household, but science fiction wasn't that common. My first real experience with science fiction was in sixth grade. I was in an advanced English class, which I have to give a shout out to my teachers for sixth and seventh grade that created that program, Mrs. Maxwell and Mrs. Anderson, because they really took my love of reading to the next level. I enjoyed reading before that. I would be happy to sit down on a book, but I wasn't a voracious reader. And being in an English class where we were allowed to pick what we read within a general reason, often we'd be given a list and our teachers would sit down and help us pick which ones we wanted to read instead of the traditional English. Here's a book that is a classic, but we're all forced to read it. It allowed me to find a love for reading. It also got me into writing for the first time. We wrote a lot in those classes. And a lot of my first writing was terrible, and I hope it never sees the light of day. But it really brought about that inspiration. And those classes were some of the most successful classes I was in growing up. I was inspired a lot, but on top of that, as far as I'm aware, there's at least 4 published authors that were in those classes with me, which is insane to think that a class of 20, 4 of us ended up being published. So I have to give them a big shout out. It's been a big deal for me, everything they've inspired. And on one of those lists, I remember sitting there, it was the middle of winter, we had a list, and I'd either already read several on the list, or there were several others that just didn't sound appealing, not my genre. I'm not typically a witches and scary stories person. I do write them. I just placed in a contest with a zombie story, which I will be talking about in detail as soon as I can. But on that list was a single science fiction novel. And my English teacher pointed to me and said, "Hey, you like this kind of story in fantasy, maybe let's try it in science fiction." And that was Ender's Game. This book is one of my personal favorites of all time, still is to this day. And I have read it at least a dozen times. This one, obviously, leather-bound signed edition. This is one of the first ones I purchased. And this will be a staple for me forever. It brought me into both military science fiction and science fiction in general. Once I had read the Ender series, I went down a rabbit hole. Spent time in the school library, in the public library, trying to find stories that really inspired me. And we're going to talk about several of them. There's a large chunk of these, especially the ones that I have in the more collector's editions, that I read at that age. It heavily influenced me, heavily influenced my writing. My first dabbles into science fiction writing came in about the 8th grade when I was in a creative writing class. But a lot of them are contained in anthologies because a lot of older science fiction was shorter. It was in that 30 to 50,000 word range. So a lot of times you'll find them in collections like this. This book contains War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells, Journey to the Center of the Earth by Jules Verne. I've got a different copy that has Edgar Rice Burroughs, but a couple of his books are in here as well. On top of that, I discovered Battlefield Earth, which I don't have an edition of yet. I am working on that. When I find it, I will get it. That was one of the first other science fiction books besides Orson Scott Card that I had read. I love it. I've since read it a few times and actually got to do beta listening when they were coming out with the new audiobook. So that was super, super fun. And I hope to get to do it again. Edgar Rice Burroughs is another big one for me. A Princess of Mars was a very interesting story that challenged a lot of what I thought of science fiction at this point and really made me think as well. This one also has At the Earth's Core, also an amazing story. So if you want to read some classic science fiction, please check out those anthologies or very, very famous authors like Edgar Rice Burroughs and H.G. Wells and Jules Verne. They are amazing things, especially if you want to write science fiction. These are the foundation. If you read them, they will help you formulate better science fiction. Next was one that I still love, and I was glad to finally see get a very good adaptation, and that is Dune by Frank Herbert. This is one of my all-time favorite science fiction novels to this day. It is much more deep thinking than a lot of the other stuff I read. There's layers and nuances to the story that rival epic fantasy, and that is something that I love in science fiction. If you have read my science fiction novel that's out so far, you'll see a little bit of that, but there is so much more coming in there. I did just about as much world building for my science fiction universe as I did for my epic fantasy universe. And this is the reason why. This book really made it clear that you can pull things from other genres to amplify your stories in science fiction. You can do it in fantasy. You can blur the line between the two, and it is amazing. So, if you haven't read it, please read it. Another one that did that for me, 2001: A Space Odyssey. Great story, great movie. I actually saw the movie before I read the book, but I love this one. Also, very thought-provoking and challenging, and makes you think about the way you view humanity. Definitely a recommendation. Okay, the next one you guys will recognize, even if you don't know science fiction, and that is Star Wars. The books are amazing. I did see the movies first. I had seen those, I think, back around that same sixth grade time for the first time. Love Star Wars. It does a very similar thing to Dune, where it blurs the lines using a lot of fantasy tropes to tell an amazing story that challenges the way people think about science fiction. And this is the original trilogy. It's got George Lucas as well as several other supporting authors that created this. Love this book. It has been read multiple times. But George Lucas isn't the only one in that universe that has created amazing stories. This is another one of my personal favorites. This is a recent one called Padawan by Kirsten White. Amazing story. I loved this. I grew up in the prequels era, so I grew up going to the theaters to watch episode 1, 2, and 3, so they are very special to me. So getting Obi-Wan's backstory a little bit was a lot of fun, and I definitely recommend that story. It's one of the most well-written modern Star Wars stories, so it is an absolute recommendation. That covers a lot of my early years into science fiction and into more recent times. I have a lot of recent ones. I've gotten back into science fiction lately and have deep dived it, specifically after I found Warhammer and got pulled back in. But one of the other big stories that yanked me hard back into science fiction was Expeditionary Force. This is Columbus Day, the first book in the series, and Craig Allenson is one of my favorite authors, period. He is very different with the way he writes. He does a lot of humor while telling a very serious story, and it is awesome. I definitely recommend this. They're very quick reads, and if you're an audiobook person, R.C. Bray does these. He is one of the best narrators I have ever seen. I absolutely recommend going the audiobook route if you're not a pick up the physical book and read it person. The physical books are also amazing. Another recent discovery is Unforgettable by Eric James Stone. He's a good friend, and I've loved getting to read his book. It's a more near future story, which isn't typically where I run. I usually tend to go deep into the future and write aliens and epic military writing, but this has actually provided me with a lot of inspiration that led to a recent book that I am working on getting published. It's out being queried now, so hopefully you guys will get to see that here in the near future. But definitely worth a read, and Eric does an amazing job with this. Okay, next is one of my favorite genres and worlds in science fiction in general, and that is Warhammer 40k. You guys have seen me talk about it a lot. I actually got into it through the books, this book in particular. It's The Founding by Dan Abnett. It's the Gonskos series. This is the pinnacle for me of military science fiction. There are a lot of other ones, especially in the Star Wars realm. Timothy Zahn does an amazing job with his books. I'll post those here as well. But for military science fiction, for me, this is the pinnacle. I've read a lot of very good Warhammer books since, But this, if you've ever seen the show Band of Brothers, this is Band of Brothers with a sci-fi twist. It is stunning. You learn so much about individual characters, and it focuses on individual soldiers in combat and gives them real life reactions to the reality around them, which is terrible. They're literally fighting for the lives of themselves, and it's a unit of soldiers who actually lost their world while they were leaving to be trained. So they had to watch their world burn before they could do anything about it. And they're fighting to make sure that does not happen to anyone else. It has some of my favorite characters I have ever read in science fiction, and they deeply inspired me. On top of that, Dan and his writing style has actually helped me find my own. He writes it in a very almost grimdark fashion with just a little bit of hope sprinkled over the top so that you don't feel like it's the grimdark feeling that nothing will ever get better. And it always does. It always does get a little bit better with Dan. But it's never a fix the universe in a single stroke better. It's a average person doing good things, making things better. So absolutely recommend this book. I love it so much. And this entire series is amazing. So if you're ever curious about Warhammer 40K, this is where I'd recommend starting. If you've already started with the tabletop and you know the basic lore, find your favorite faction of Space Marines, dive in there. Or if you're a Xenos player, there's stories about almost every Xenos faction or Chaos faction. Find those, start there, but I would highly recommend reading this eventually. Now, like I said, find your Space Marine faction. White Scars are mine. This is why. This is a collection of short stories that focus on them that are stunning. I love the fact that Warhammer 40K and the Black Library bring in so many different authors to write so many different stories. It gives their universe such broad strokes and helps create a massive appeal. And because of that, it's actually one of my bucket list things as a writer, is to at least get a short story into the Warhammer 40K universe. I love that. And I already have some ideas for a Space Marine story that I'm working on. So hopefully I'll get to share that with you guys someday too. Okay. Now, we're going to talk about one of my favorite authors of all time. I've talked about him a lot, and because he's a multi-genre author, he's been talked about a lot in these videos so far, and that is Brandon Sanderson. His Cytoverse series is a great gateway to science fiction, especially if you're a young reader. So I would highly recommend this. It's an amazing read. It's an easy read. It doesn't have massive technical terms being dropped on you like some of these other ones, but it is absolutely worth reading. Whether you're deeply experienced in science fiction or whether you're new to it, this is also a great place to start. It is a great introduction with a little bit of fantasy sprinkled over the top to make it comfortable for any reader that is into fiction. So I would definitely recommend that. The last book that I would recommend is actually one of Brandon Sanderson's secret projects. That's the Frugal Wizard's that is the Frugal Wizard's Handbook for Surviving Medieval England. Big title, but it is very good. It's a type of portal science fiction that's not typically my read, but the way the story is told is amazing. It ties in historical fiction with science fiction and creates a universe where a time traveler goes back to medieval England, but not exactly the same medieval England, and has to deal with a combination of both old magic and new technology to overcome a amazing situation. So I highly, highly recommend this. So those are my big science fiction book recommendations. If you guys have others for me, please comment them below. I would love to hear what science fiction stories you guys love to read. And if I haven't read them, I'm always looking. So I said, comment below, tell me what you guys love to read, and tell me what you guys want to hear about next. I am a multi-genre reader. I love reading dozens of different genres. I've written in dozens of different genres as well. So comment below if you want to see a specific genre, specific author focused on. I can't wait to talk to you guys, and we'll see you next week.